So we don't know what type of medications yet. That hasn't been unveiled. What we do know is that they're going to allow Pfizer to sell the drugs on a federal government website called TrumpRx, which was announced today. So on this website, TrumpRx, some of the Pfizer drugs will be sold there. Which drugs and how much is of a discount is there going to be? We don't know yet.
Let's talk about tariffs and really how maybe some of these imported pharmaceuticals impacted the price of drugs. Have we seen that? And then were any of the Pfizer drugs impacted by that as a result?
No. So one of the things that Pfizer negotiated with the government related to this deal that was announced today by President Trump and administration was that they would get a 3-year exemption from the tariffs and the threat of tariffs. Because what's happening is, right, the federal government really is using the tariffs as a leverage point to get pharmaceutical companies to really do what Pfizer did today, which is to try to lower the prices of the drugs, make them available on the TrumpRx website, make them available through Medicaid so that people have easier access to these drugs. So Pfizer really is the first of the companies to do that. But the significance here is Pfizer, as you well know and many know, is the number one drug company in the world. It's very influential. And so when Pfizer does something, typically other companies tend to follow. Pfizer is also expected to commit about $70 billion in investing in research, development, and most importantly, in domestic manufacturing. Remember, when Trump originally announced the tariffs a few months ago, one of the things that he was really pushing the companies to do was to manufacture here in the U.S.
So let's talk a little bit about at least what we know so far. I'm sure some of the details are yet to come out, but we know the White House is unveiling this direct-to-consumer website for Americans to buy these drugs. It's called TrumpRx. In your mind, as a medical professional, what are the benefits here, and are there any negatives to this?
No, quite honestly, there aren't any negatives. It's overall a positive for patients because it'll eliminate the middlemen, which Trump has been talking about for years, even in his first administration, which are the pharmacy benefit managers that play a role in hiking up the cost of many of these drugs. And it'll make it easier for patients to get the drugs directly from the manufacturer, in this case, Pfizer. So overall, I see it to be a really positive outcome. And to the administration's credit, this is the first administration that actually had substantive change as it comes to this issue of drug pricing.
Do you think this will be the only company? Pfizer is one that we're talking about. Do you see any others wanting to get on board? Because the only reason I ask that is because I think of drugs that, have made it into the news in the past where we've seen the prices skyrocket. And in some cases, it didn't make sense. It almost seemed like a money grab. Do you think this is a way for government to try to regulate those prices with even more companies?
Yeah, very good question. I think more companies will concede. Here's why. I think one, the regulatory threats, right, and leverage points from the government is real. It's important. And so I think that could influence their thinking in terms of determining whether or not to be involved. So I think that's a big one, especially the tariffs. But also the fact that in the end of the day, for pharmaceutical companies, as you know, they don't have the best reputation in among American patients, and that's unfortunate because I do, as a former pharma exec, I can tell you they do a lot of good for society and for patients. I think the issue of drug pricing has, of course, been, kind of a thorn in their side. So I do think from a reputation perspective, they'll also want to preserve the reputation. You don't want to be the drug company that doesn't participate and doesn't get involved. So there might be pushback, but if I was, to hedge a bet, I would say most likely many of the companies are going to concede and end up, allowing their drugs to be on this TrumpRx platform and trying to participate in the most favored nation.
I'm looking at an article here, and this last line really kind of hints at what I just spoke about. It says, while the U.S. has less than 5% of the world's population, it funds about 75% of global pharmaceutical profits. And this is according to the White House. How do you see this impacting that bottom line moving forward?
It depends on which drugs are going to be on the list. If it's drugs that aren't the major drivers of the revenue for the pharmaceutical companies, right? If they're drugs at the end of their life cycle, not much. If these are the drugs that the companies are depending on to as the engine to drive growth for the next 2 to 3 years, then yes, it could make a difference in the bottom line. But here's the thing. Remember, and President Trump said this today in his announcement, the U.S. has been subsidizing, the cost of these drugs across the country, across the world rather, for many, many years. As you just mentioned, 70% of the profits worldwide come from the U.S. That's crazy, right? We're about a what, 350 million, population. So I think, it's important to recognize that this is a step in the right direction. The only, I guess, concern would be, when you kind of alluded to it, is that if this impacts the bottom line, could this impact innovation? And I think some of the people that are concerned about these policies are worried ultimately about long-term, could this impact innovation in R&D? My pushback would be that a lot of the innovation that is supported by the pharmaceutical companies comes from the government. We saw that with the COVID vaccine, for example. So we'll have to, it remains to be seen how much of that will be impacted when it comes to like R&D and innovation long term.
I'm just thinking about my own healthcare insurance, for example, and in some cases, this employer, but previous employers, when I've signed up for insurance coverage, when it comes to being able to get medications, it's through a particular pharmacy. Will people that have those type of plans, from what you've learned on this, I know it's still early on, will they still be able to reap the benefits of this? Because, for example, there are some people that can only get their lower prescription costs through CVS, or can only get that lowered prescription cost through Walgreens. Will they be impacted by this too?
It isn't clear how this is going to work with insurers, with pharmacies, with the kind of the reimbursement system or drug supply chains. So that still remains to be seen. We'll have to see how this plays out. This is the first time, this is being rolled out, ever. So in terms of the logistics and, ordering, these medications and how it gets shipped online and things like that, that remains to be seen. It seems like it's going to be a situation where you go online, you order the product from the manufacturer, and it'll just get shipped to you directly, as long as you have some type of evidence of a prescription, right? Because that's what you need at a pharmacy typically. So whether that eliminates that or not, it's not clear. So I think we'll have to see kind of the details around that logistically.
I know you spoke about, will this impact essentially innovation on the pharmaceutical front? My other question for you is, what in your mind would be the benefit for Pfizer, for example, being the first to get on board with this?
So I think reputational risk is important, and credibility in the market, being that leader first. And I think also not having to deal with some of those regulatory threats that I talked about earlier, the tariffs, for example, being exempt from that. I think that's a big one. That's going to save Pfizer tons of money, right? Versus other companies that might have to deal with that. So I think the savings alone on the tariffs are going to be key. And remember that Pfizer necessarily, when they list a drug, that list price isn't what they make because of the middlemen. This eliminates the middlemen. And people don't realize that, I think, when it comes to pharmaceutical companies, they're not necessarily the ones that decide what that drug is going to cost out of pocket. Again, the pharmacy benefit managers decide where it goes on the tier in your formulary in terms of your insurance company. So that plays a big role in terms of how much you pay out of pocket. So for the pharmaceutical company, their goal is to make sure you have access to the medication. They want you to have access to the medication. Matter of fact, we work, my organization, the ACMA, we work with over 1,000 pharmaceutical companies, and we make sure we help them to make sure that they're getting patients to get access to their medications. Remember, they're vested in making sure that the patients get the medications they need, because at the end of the day, they want them to have positive outcomes. So I think this could help, at least for those Medicaid patients.
I'm looking at, all that you've accomplished. You're Dr. William Solomon. You're the founder and CEO of the Accreditation Council for Medical Affairs and the founder and CEO of White Manna Capital Partners, a biotech pharma-focused hedge fund. You've been at this for a while. What have you seen in terms of pharmaceutical prices? We hear people say, those prices are ridiculous. They're price gouging. They're going after grandma and grandpa. They don't have this kind of money to just shell out. Is that true that we've seen those pharmaceutical prices over the last 10, 15, 20 years just go straight up in the air?
Yeah. I wish I could tell you yes, definitively or no definitively and, make it that simple. But the answer is that sometimes it is fair and sometimes it's not. It depends on the outcome and what you perceive as valuable. If you're paying, like the other day I had on my podcast, the Will Solomon podcast, the president of the American Medical Association, Bobby McCamala, and him and I were talking about a brain tumor he was diagnosed with. So he had this brain tumor and there's this drug which he was prescribed, which basically prevented the tumor from growing. It kept it, small so that he could stay alive. Now that drug, I think he told me, costs $250,000 a year. That's what they bill the insurance. In that case, I would argue it's worth it, right? It's keeping you alive. In some cases, depending on the outcome that you're looking at, is the drug worth it? So this is this whole idea of what we call in the industry cost effectiveness. Is the cost worth what you're getting? If it means you're going to live a few months longer, is that worth the cost? If it means it's going to keep you alive, it's a rare disease, is that worth a few $100,000 a year? I remember, when I worked in pharma, there was a drug I worked on, it was $600,000 a year, but it prevented children from getting intellectually disabled and allowed them to live. So, I think it just depends, in that situation, if I was the parent, I would want to make sure that my children had access to these medications. But in the end of the day, it's what the market ultimately is willing to bear. And I think it goes back to this conversation about most favored nations. I think to Trump's credit, he recognized that the American public was getting unfairly treated, which is why he felt like we should try to make the drug prices on par with other countries. And to that, I commend him for that because I think it's a positive overall.
Yeah, you mentioned Dr. Bobby Mukamala. I've had plenty of conversations with him right here on Fox 32 in different platforms. Yes. Let me ask you, how realistic is it in your mind for other big pharma companies to get on board with this and play ball and do the right thing by the American people?
Again, I think that the fact that Pfizer did it, I think you're going to see a domino effect. I think you're going to see other companies now conceding and agreeing. And I think, it remains to be seen. But if I was a betting man, I would say all of your big pharma companies, your Mercks, Novartis, BMS, Glaxo, they're probably, most likely going to concede and agree. I would imagine in the next few weeks. I don't think you're going to have a lot of pushback there.